in terms of the situation of Muslims today, the diversity in the Muslim world is extraordinary. And I mean, it took the New York Times a long time to pick up on it. If you go back and you look at the New York Times 10, 15 years ago, every time they had a story on women in Islam, they had looked like the same woman in Saudi Arabia. Since she's covered, you know, who would know? But whenever they wanted to talk about women, it was always a woman in Saudi Arabia and the way she dressed. It wasn't a woman in Malaysia, you know, and it was a woman can't drive a car, you know, rather than Malaysia where they drive motorcycles or scooters or, you know, whatever. The diversity in the Muslim world, and that's what comes out also in our Gallup data. There's an enormous, not just linguistic and cultural diversity, but in terms of Muslim attitudes. And it's much different than we expect. For example, if you ask Americans, what do you admire about Islam and Muslims? 57% say nothing or I don't know. All right? And almost 54%, on the other hand, consistently say, I really don't know much about Islam, and I really should. And those percentages don't change that much. In the last 2 years, it's gotten maybe 2 or 3% better, okay? That's something to think about. On the other hand, we, most of us, are convinced that they really have a problem with us, not just the extremists, you know? And so we even use phrases like, why do they hate us? And don't just apply it to the extremists, but it's almost like we equate it with anti-Americanism also, as if that means hatred of America rather than you know, having a problem with our foreign policy. When we actually ask Muslims, what do you admire about the West? They have lots of answers. They admire our rule of law. They admire our freedoms, our democracy. They admire our work ethic, our technology, our economic development, and indeed would like them. Okay? When we actually talk and survey and do a survey that represents the voices of 1 billion Muslims, we find that majorities of Muslims want these things for themselves. We find a minority of Muslims, whom we call the political radicals, or potential radicals. This is about 7% of the world's Muslims. They're not people who engage in violence, but they are people that think for one reason or another that 9/11 was justified. But we find that potential radicals, even more than the mainstream, believe that democracy is the way forward and better relations with the West the way forward. But unlike the mainstream, they don't believe that'll ever happen. Their cynicism is fed by the belief that the United States and some European countries, not all, they distinguish clearly between the US and Britain under Bush and Blair and European countries. The belief is that Western powers operate with a double standard when it comes to issues of democracy and human rights. The tendency not to promote democracy, what Richard Haas, when he was with the Bush administration, described as democratic exceptionalism, you know, as America's sort of history of its relations and the promotion of democracy in the Middle East, and the tendency to talk about human rights, but to devalue Islam and Muslim lives, you know, and to feel that that was denigrated, okay? All of that is there. It's a much more complex picture.